My name is Dave Csinos, as Karen said, and thank you for that warm introduction, Karen. I'm a faculty member at Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, and I teach here in the areas of faith formation and homiletics and ministry innovation. I'm excited to say that we have a few of our wonderful students joining us today at this conference. I'm also the founder of Faith Forward, which, as Karen said, is an ecumenical network for innovation in ministry with children and youth and families. And at our website there, you can find a podcast that I host with some of today's most creative and cutting edge leaders. I'm really excited to be back at the Toronto Children's Ministry Conference. I spoke at it almost 10 years ago, and it is fantastic to be here coming to you today from Halifax. It's a true privilege. So we have this theme today of ministry in 3D. And it seems a little strange, I'll be honest, to talk about ministry in 3D while we are looking at 2D digital representations of each other. But maybe the fact that the pandemic has for a year and a half thrust us into these 2D spaces means that ministry in 3D matters even more than it did before. But I'm tired of living in a 3D world. Yes, we do get to attend fantastic conferences like today's without having to spend time and money on the privilege of taking off our belts, shoes, and jackets and praying to God that our pants don't fall down as we stand in our socks with our arms in the air at airport security. For some of you who are closer, maybe you just don't have to fight the traffic on the 401 today. But instead, we can attend this conference while sitting at our kitchen tables, stretched out on our couches, maybe even laying in our beds as we wonder together who among us is wearing pajama pants. Business on the top, comfort on the bottom, right? We all know COVID life far too well. We've been living in it for 20 months, and it seems like forever. But it's actually only 4.42% of my life. That's it, not even 5%. For others of you, it might be more like 2% or maybe up to 10% of your lifespan that's been spent in COVID. But for my nephew, who celebrates his 8th birthday next weekend, quarantine has encapsulated over 1/5 of his life. 1/5. And his 3.5-year-old brother has spent almost half his life under the cloak of the pandemic. Apart from special celebrations like my older nephew's first communion, they haven't felt safe attending church in person since the pandemic began early last year. We who work with children in faith communities, we're tired. I know we are. We are tired of Zoom worship. We are tired of only seeing the top half of faces of our children's faces in our church. This isn't what we signed up for. It isn't what we expected. It's not how we want things to be anymore. I get it. I'm with you. The novelty of attending church from home has long disappeared. I'm not a soothsayer. I've never said any sooths. And so while we all know that one day things are going to return to some semblance of normal, whatever that normal might be, I want to take us back to a time before COVID. A time when words like social distancing, pandemic fatigue, and maskne would have been met with blank stares. Back to a world when life was lived in 3D. Diversity, discovery, direction. So I'll take you back to 2013 and 2014. During these years, I spent time engaged in qualitative research at 4 congregations that were part of the United Church of Canada. And each congregation self-identified culturally in different ways. Each congregation was a culture in and of itself, like all are. My goal was to learn about how children make theological meaning in different cultural contexts. Some of the congregations were rural, urban, suburban. Some were wealthy. Some were really had major financial challenges. There were small churches with the smallest being about 12 people at worship, and mid-sized churches with 100 or 200 people. And some were declining in numbers and some were experiencing growth. Some were 200 years old, some were 20 years old. There was one church that was predominantly white, one church that was made up of immigrants from Ghana, one that was indigenous, and one that was intentionally seeking to become intercultural. I'll just say these are not the pictures of the churches, but they kind of speak to the diversity of these churches. And when I talk about any children or churches today, I'm not going to use their real names. In terms of my time at these churches, from anywhere in between a couple of months to over a year and a half, I spent time at each of these congregations participating in worship and helping with Sunday school and vacation Bible school. I interviewed about 5 children from each church, and I had a focus group with adult leaders. So what I want to share with you are some of the things that I learned on this journey, a journey about diversity and discovery and direction. It's a journey that has had much to say to those of us here today, as we seek out what ministry with children might look like in a 3D world on the other side of the pandemic. So as I said, my goal was to understand how children make theological meaning in different cultural contexts. And there were times in this research when I heard comments and was asked questions like about why I wanted to include a predominantly white church, since according to some of these commentators, white churches have no culture. Now, these comments speak to a deep-rooted assumption among individuals and communities who are part of the dominant culture of the Western world, and of North America especially. Views have been shifting, but there is this persistent assumption that culture is something that's other to what is dominant. It's something possessed by people who are different than the norm, whatever the norm means, because of their race or ethnicity, their country of origin, sexual orientation, religion, or another marker of diversity. It's the same reason that there's sometimes a culture or an ethnic food aisle in the grocery store where we can buy Jamaican ginger beer, Japanese ramen, and all sorts of curries. Foods that are not seen as normal for the white Anglo-dominated society are relegated to an aisle all their own, where we label them as other through terms like ethnic. What exactly is culture? We talk about traveling to different cultures, taking in high culture at the symphony, studying the ancient culture of the Israelites, and even our yogurt has cultures. It's a term that we use so often and in so many ways, but what exactly do I mean when I'm talking about culture? And for this, I really tend to lean on a Canadian sociologist named Carl James. And he offers a definition of culture that I find really helpful because it gives a sense of just how broad and deep this thing is. Culture, he says, is a concept that refers to the way in which a given society, community, or group organizes and conducts itself as distinguished from that of other societies, communities, or groups. Culture, he says, consists of a dynamic and complex set of values, beliefs, norms, patterns of thinking, styles of communication, linguistic expressions, and ways of interpreting and interacting with the world that help people understand and thus survive their varied circumstances. So culture is anything and everything that combines together to make up the whole way of life of a group of people. So we all have cultures. We are all shaped by, and we all shape the cultures in which we participate. In a way, every food in a supermarket is a cultural product, regardless of what aisle it's in, because from the fact that it's even used in cooking to begin with, but also how it's grown, how we use it in the dishes we prepare, and how we package and present it, and how it's sold to us. These are all cultural manifestations. We are all cultural participants. And often we exist in multiple cultures that are competing for the right to be the dominant force of influence on our lives. So I also appreciate Carl James's definition because he frees culture from ethnicity, which many people assume to be synonymous, thanks in part to the rise of Canadian multiculturalism that focused on one's ethnicity or family's nation of origin. Culture does involve ethnicity. but it's so much bigger than this. So we can speak of things like Congolese culture and Russian culture and French Canadian culture. These might be described as ethnic-based cultures, but we can also talk about the culture of a particular city or of a religious group like evangelical Christians, or Muslim culture, or hip hop culture, or social media culture, and most important for the research I'm going to share with you, congregational culture. Congregations can in and of themselves be distinct cultural contexts, because congregations have particular sets of values, beliefs, norms, patterns of thinking, styles of communication, linguistic expressions, and ways of interpreting and interacting with the world, which is right from Carl James's definition. First Presbyterian Church and Second Presbyterian Church in the same city see themselves and organize their lives differently. A Catholic church and a Baptist church on the same street, likewise, are distinct cultures of themselves, even though they share aspects by being so close to each other. Now, the lines between these cultures in which we live are not fixed. They're not firm. Cultures are porous and they're malleable, and the borders between them shift and adapt as culture shapes us and as we shape it. Even our theologies are cultural products, because there's no such thing as a theology or a belief that has not been touched by the all-pervasive hands of culture. Theology is a human phenomenon. God is not, but our understanding of God is. And it's created and sustained and cast in stone by cultural beings in response to the particularities of time and place. So, armed with all of these assumptions, I set out to explore how children make theological meaning in different cultural contexts. In this case, congregations that self-identify in different ways. I spent various lengths of time, from a few months to more than a year, as I said, at each of these congregations. And this was a deeply personal exploration for me, because I grew up in the heyday of multiculturalism. That's me at about, I don't know, the awkward age of 12 or 13, at a multicultural fair funded by the federal government, where I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. So I grew up in the heyday of multiculturalism in the 1980s and 90s, when culture was at the forefront of discourse about Canadian life. My elementary school years were replete with assignments related to exploring your cultural background and backgrounds of other Canadians as well. But the view of culture that I learned was watered down. It was a simplistic notion that didn't leave room for complexity and contradiction. And it wasn't until my adult years, especially through an experience of living outside of the Canadian culture and then reintegrating back home, that my view of culture became more complex than simply a synonym for ethnicity. Gradually, I broadened and I nuanced my view of culture, and I recognized that individual congregations, like the ones that participated in my research, like my home congregation, like your congregation, they're indeed unique cultures of their own. And so I married this interest in culture and diversity with a long-time interest in children's spirituality, and I set out to explore how children make theological meaning in different cultural contexts. So at its broadest level, this research has taught me that the ways that children make theological meaning are in many ways reflective of the culture of their broader congregation, especially its theological ethos. So theological views, how people created theological views, how people practice their faith, how people express their theologies, the language people used, how all of this, the way that children used theology, was related to the way their congregation used theology. The way that the children made sense of God, how they practiced their faith, how they understood the role of church, how they saw their place in God's world. These were all deeply related to the ideas and practices and experiences of their broader church community. And this goes far beyond the content of their theologies, like the particular views of how God interacts with one's life, because it extends also to the sources that they draw from and the processes that they use to generate theology. Because theology isn't just what we think, We don't just receive our theological beliefs uncritically from someone else in what Paulo Freire famously calls the banking approach to education. Theology isn't given to us, it's made. So how children made theology, and not just what they thought, was related to their wider cultural and theological ethos of their congregation. But this doesn't mean it was a mere image. Rather, the congregational culture became a launching point. It was a place from which the kids took their own theological excursions, and they made meaning of their experience and ideas and context in ways that are all their own. Now, if any of you have read Catherine Tanner's classic book, Theories of Culture, you know that culture, being part of a culture, doesn't mean everyone is the same. It means that that culture is a point of convergence of different opinions. And there is a variety of views and practices existing and competing within one culture. And children's views and practices are part of that. Now, this might not seem like a terribly novel or an exciting finding. You might be thinking, wow, way to waste a year and a half of your life. Of course, the theologies of young people create and bear the marks of their broader context. Of course that is. I could have told you that. But the thing is, when we actually stop to consider this, then it really changes how we do children's ministry. When we actually put our assumptions on hold and we consider what these children taught me, and what they teach us today, our common means for understanding children's theological lives and how we minister to them are disrupted, because no longer can we blindly rely on big box curricula that are mass produced with no eye for cultural context, because we need to critically reflect and attend to the cultures in which we're working, and not assume that if a VBS program worked well out of the box at the church down the road or on another continent, it's going to be effective in our own congregation too. We can't assume that children are learning the exact things we're wanting to teach them because they're making their own theology as we are working with them. I mean, we all know this, right? Children are unique individuals capable of incredibly rich theological thought. But it's another thing to actually let this reality seep deep into our bones, because to do so is to allow our current practices to be turned upside down and inside out. Now, let me explain what I mean by talking about two things I learned from this research, how they upended my assumptions about the faith lives of children. Now, first, from academic research to websites for volunteers to books about children's ministry, books for children's ministry professionals, and off-the-shelf curricula, children's ministry pays a lot of attention to the content of children's beliefs. Companies spend a lot of money developing curriculum, really great resources, for example, that explain to children why the 10 Commandments matter, or what it means that Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, or how to understand that ongoing presence of Jesus in our world today. We are told all the time, explicitly and implicitly, that what children think theologically matters. But what about how they think? What about the processes by which children generate their beliefs in the first place? One of the most interesting dimensions of the processes of children's theology that I observed is that the meaning that they make and the processes by which they make that meaning might actually yield very different insights into their inner lives. Let me explain this by talking about two children, or a few children at Burke Street, a predominantly white middle-class suburban congregation. Now, during my first visit to this church, I noticed that there were two children who I'll call Stephen and Rebecca. They were Sunday school superstars. They were the kids who their teacher could always count on to answer her questions, and for the most part, they would offer the responses that the Sunday school teacher was looking for. Both children were very willing to, with me in our interviews, to talk about their congregation and their ideas, and Stephen in particular was quite eloquent and displayed a strong degree of complexity as he shared his theological ideas with me. But when I pushed them to go deeper into their thinking, and rather than just tell me what they've learned at church, but tell me what they think, both of them actually struggled to do this. The content of their theological ideas showed degrees of maturity and thoughtfulness and was well developed. But the processes for creating their own theological ideas were pretty weak as compared to the ideas that they spoke. Now, on the other hand, some children at the very same church had a difficult time speaking to me about their theological ideas, but they were actually engaged in rigorous processes through which they created theological meaning. Take Nicholas, for example. He was anything but a Sunday school superstar. He hated going to Sunday school, and at times it was challenging for me to get him to talk about his theological ideas at any length. He seemed like the polar opposite of Stephen and Rebecca. But over halfway through our conversation, he started to tell me about the struggles he has to believe some of the things that he hears about in Sunday school and in worship services where he prefers to spend his time at church. And as I asked him to tell me more about why he believes some things that he hears and not other things, he made meaning in a way that demonstrated a desire to engage in very rich and deep theological thinking as he formed his own parameters for discerning the level of truth and reliability among biblical stories. In his words, what actually could have happened and what's probably just a story that's made up. The content of Nicholas's theological meaning making may have been tenuous, but the means by which he generated meaning demonstrated a willingness to think deeply and wrestle with issues inherently wrapped in uncertainty and mystery and wonder. Content and process matters to the faith lives of children. It's not enough to simply teach children what to think. We also need to help them develop the capacities to think theologically in the first place. That's the first assumption that kind of upended some of mine. But the second is this. These children call me to consider not just theology as something that's individual, but something that is communal. Many studies in the field of children's spirituality and religious education rely on individualistic research methods, like one-on-one interviews. You might have read my first book, Children's Ministry That Fits, and it's a practice that I engaged in. I did one-on-one interviews with that early research. And actually, for this project, I imagined it being carried out through individual interviews as well. Luckily, there was one congregation who said to me that their theology of community is so crucial for who they are as a church, being intercultural, that it would have been inappropriate for the interviews to be carried out without some form of community. They said, we do everything in community. We don't do anything one-on-one or anything alone in this church. So if you want us to be part of this research, you have to interview the children in small groups. And thank goodness. Now, for other circumstances, in other churches, I interviewed children in pairs and small groups from time to time as well. And it became clear to me that theological meaning making can be a highly collaborative and communal process. The children that I interviewed in pairs or small groups engaged in theological meaning making through conversations with each other. They challenged, they affirmed, they questioned each other's ideas and perspectives on all sorts of issues like who God is and how sin works in the world and how creation came to be and what our responsibility is toward it. So let me tell you about a time that I saw this communal theology at work in an interview with two boys that I'll call Jacob and Enoch. Now, at one point, Enoch, the older of the two, said that he once heard a saying that was something like, whenever you lie, a lightning bolt hits you that God throws at you, which you can't really see. Now, after Enoch said this, the other boy, Jacob, he didn't seem to think that this matched his perspectives because he admitted to us that he's lied, but he's never been hit by lightning. So instead of discounting Enoch's idea, Jacob demonstrated a willingness to expand his theological imagination in light of our conversation. As we continued to speak, these two boys and me, Jacob wondered out loud, maybe the reason he doesn't get struck by lightning when he's lied is because he already knows that he's lied. And since he knows that he's lied, God doesn't need to bring it to his attention with some sort of high voltage warning. This is why he concluded he's never been hit by lightning when he lies. Now, we might be prone at times to chuckle at this, But these children are demonstrating a deep willingness to engage in theological meaning that they are making in conversation with each other, as they consider respectfully one another's ideas, and as they allow their own ideas to intersect with them. These young theologians challenge me to see children's theological meaning making as a communal endeavor. It's not a solo performance. It's more like jazz improvisation, a highly relational enterprise. Each child is going to bring their unique and particular ideas and questions and slants to the process of creating theology. They'll put their own riffs on things, but as they put their heads together, new sounds can be formed that cannot be heard fully apart from one another, from what each other are bringing to the music. Now, these children didn't only offer insights that transformed how I understand children from a conceptual view. They also give us clues for the practice of faith formation, how pastoral leaders and volunteers can better engage children in theological formation. Now, one thing they have taught me is that we need to put primary emphasis on equipping children to make their own theological meaning. As I said, in the world of children's ministry, there is a tendency for resources and programs and curricula to focus on giving children particular nuggets of theological content. But the theological meaning making of these children challenged these instructional styles of children's ministry, because they all demonstrated that theology isn't something that they learn. As much as we might talk about how to pass on the faith, I hear that all the time, it's actually something that's impossible for us to do. We don't pass on faith. Faith is a gift of God that's cultivated in part through the expansive use of our theological imaginations. Children actively produce their own theology and form their own faith as they engage in and reflect on their congregations, their life experiences, their theological ideas that they hear from others in their lives. Now, some of the congregations that were part of this project, children's ministry seemed to focus on imparting specific points or facts to children. And within these churches, children sometimes struggled to generate their own ideas. So we who work with children in churches and in other ministry settings like camps, we can move away from attempts to teach them particular facts or points and toward approaches that provide them with tools for and practice with active theological reflection. Of course, we want to teach them doctrine, and we want to teach them healthy, life-giving, loving views of God. But we can't just stop there. We have to use resources at our disposal to help young people engage in theological reflection for themselves. Now, a second practice for ministry that these children gave hints to me about is that they called me to look more closely examine curricula and models for children's ministry, whether it's Sunday school or VBS or other initiatives, and to look at them in light of our broader congregational cultures. Because there were moments during this research that I perceived congregations to be engaging in children's formation in ways that actually contradicted and even undermined the broader cultural ethos and values of their faith community. So, for example, there were pastoral leaders at some churches who wanted to help congregants of all ages, including children, to explore stories of faith for themselves, to fall in love with them, to see themselves in the stories, to come to their own meaning about these stories, and to wonder together about all sorts of faith-related matters. But at these same churches, children's ministry tended to focus on rote memorization and learning predetermined points of Bible stories. So it didn't match the broader ethos, and it undermined the entire mission of the church. So it's incumbent on leaders, especially among congregations like mine that tend to be made up of people who self-identify as part of the dominant culture. It's incumbent on us to become researchers in our own communities. We need to study the multifaceted and complex culture of the whole congregation. And then when we're armed with what sociologists call a thick description of our churches, we can become better equipped to examine their existing and proposed ministries with children, and we can adapt them to better reflect our wider community. But this isn't a one-way street. Our congregations don't just change children's ministry to better reflect the culture of our congregations. Even more radical is to allow children's ministry to change the culture of our congregations. But that is a topic for another day. And finally, since a primary way through which children engaged in theological meaning was in conversation, I've learned the importance of providing children with opportunities to talk about their views. Whether they were with one another or they were with me, being able to discuss their ideas and their experiences gave the children space to reflect and create theology for themselves. Now, unfortunately, several of these young participants said that they don't often speak about their deep theological ideas and experiences with others. Some have actually shared their views with others and have said that their thoughts weren't always taken seriously. So they stopped sharing their views with people. But they did with me because it was a different context. This doesn't surprise me, since nearly every time I hear children share their ideas during children's sermons, I also hear the wider congregation laughing at how cute their ideas are. What message does this give the children about the value and the importance of their ideas when we chuckle when they share them just because they're different than ours? So as we engage in conversational practices with children, we would do well to remember a few ground rules that emerge from my research. First, we have to take their thoughts seriously and be careful not to judge their theologies as more or less correct, or even worse, to laugh at them. We have to allow them the space to share their inner lives in a safe space, what others call a brave space. And second, we have to be cautious to trust that even when it's hard for us to see this, children are going to make their own theological connections and their own insights. So we don't need to push our own tendencies or our own assumptions onto them. And third, I found that sometimes children need a bit of encouragement to engage in conversational approaches to theology, to make theological meaning together. They might not dive right into the process of right away, but this might not be because it doesn't matter to them. So don't give up, because they might just need some time. And we as adults might need time as well to become comfortable and accustomed with it. The good news is that none of us need seminary degrees. None of us need the best curriculum to help children make theological meaning. What we really need is a listening ear and maybe a few questions to get things rolling. Now, there is much more that I could say, but I have written it down instead. So if you are looking for more, here is a mildly shameless plug for my recent book, Little Theologians, which conference participants can get at 20% off thanks to my publisher, McGill Queen's University Press. But let me conclude by saying, I know that children's ministry leaders are busy people. Whether you are a full-time staff member or a volunteer who helps when you can, there's always curricula that needs to be chosen. There are always teachers who need to be recruited and programs that need to be organized. But make sure that you slow down and listen to the voices of children. Listen to their insights, respect their ideas, drink in their wisdom. In a way, I think children's theological imaginations are like Mr. Beaver's description of Aslan the lion in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He'll be coming and going. One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, not a tame lion. Thank you for letting me share with you.